On a stormy night deep in rural Texas, a 6-year-old girl walked quietly through the decaying hallway of an abandoned farmhouse. A crooked painting trembled on the wall, and then a faint bark echoed from behind the bricks. No one believed it. But from that very wall, they uncovered a bound, blood-stained dog, a forgotten victim of a horrifying crime buried for over 40 years. Yet what chilled everyone to the bone was when the little girl whispered, "He told me not to be afraid. He's not angry at people." Subscribe now to never miss a single moment of our emotional, suspenseful, and mysterious storytelling films. The story begins right now. Under the blistering sun of rural Texas, where dry winds scrape across rusted fences, and the earth seems to whisper old stories, the Carson farm sat untouched for nearly 3 decades. A farmhouse with chipped white paint, its porch sagging from years of weather, stood silent beneath the yawning sky. Locals said time had stopped there. Others said something else hadn't moved on. No one came near it after sundown. The last family who lived there packed up in the middle of a November night without so much as a note. Rumors ran wild in nearby towns. Strange noises, animals disappearing, and once the sheriff's dog running off into the woods behind the property and never coming back. Folks at the bar had a name for it, the house that listens, but now it was just real estate. And to Sophia Hart, a single mother on the run from old mistakes and fresh regrets, it was affordable. It was escape. A place to rebuild with her daughter, far from the city where her marriage and her veterinary career had both collapsed. She signed the deed without looking back. Sophia was 36, her face gentle but tired. The kind of woman who didn't cry anymore because it never changed anything. Her daughter Lily, just 6, had her father's blue eyes and something else too, a sensitivity Sophia couldn't explain. Lily would stop walking in the middle of a grocery store and say things like, "Someone just dropped their heart." Or she'd stare at a tree and say it was sad. It unnerved people. But Sophia had learned not to shush her. Life had shushed her enough. They arrived on a Thursday afternoon. The truck groaned to a stop at the edge of the long dirt road, dust rising like smoke around them. Sophia stepped out, cracked her back, and stared at the house. It felt too quiet. Not peaceful, just waiting. Lily, meanwhile, wandered forward, dragging her stuffed bunny by the ear, eyes fixed on the second-floor window. "Who's up there?" she asked. Sophia followed her gaze. "Empty. Just fluttering curtains. No one," she replied, forcing a smile. "It's just the wind." By the 3rd day, most boxes were unpacked. The living room had been transformed into a strange blend of old and new second-hand furniture placed against stained wallpaper, family photos competing with the age of the walls. But the house still held itself back. It didn't settle. No creaking floors, no distant groans. Just a stillness too deliberate to be comforting. That Sunday late in the afternoon, something shifted. Sophia was in the kitchen wiping down cabinets that hadn't been touched in years when Lily called from the living room. "Mommy, do you hear that?" "What, honey?" Lily didn't respond. She just stood in front of the wall where an old painting hung crooked. It was a portrait oil on canvas cracked and dusted of a grassy hill at dusk. A boy and his dog silhouettes under the sun. Lily was staring at it, unmoving. Sophia walked over, towel still in hand. "What is it, sweetheart?" Lily tilted her head. "He's scared. He's trying not to bark too loud." Sophia froze. "Who?" Lily didn't answer immediately. She pressed her ear to the wall beside the painting. "The dog." Sophia crouched next to her heart, starting to beat faster. "What do you mean, the dog?" "He's behind the picture." Sophia forced a laugh. "Maybe the painting just reminds you of one. Come on, let's..." "No." Lily looked up, voice suddenly steady. "There's a real one, and he's crying." There was a kind of silence after that. Not just quiet, but something deeper. Like the house itself was listening in. The kind of moment a mother doesn't want to believe, but can't ignore. Sophia hesitated, then stepped forward. She reached out and carefully removed the painting from the wall. Behind it was dust, cracks in the plaster, and something else, a faint outline in the wall. Rectangular, the same height as the painting. She touched it, hollow. There was a vent, old, rusted over, but clearly a metal grid that had been painted the same color as the wall to blend in. It was screwed in at all four corners, the screws stripped and almost fused to the frame. Sophia's pulse quickened. She leaned in, listened. Nothing. But Lily was still staring, eyes wide. "He stopped crying," she whispered. "He knows you're here." Sophia grabbed a flathead screwdriver from the drawer in the kitchen and came back, her hands trembling just slightly. She unscrewed the panel slowly, piece by piece. The last screw fell to the floor with a soft clink. She tugged the vent cover. It resisted, sealed by dust and time, then gave way with a dry crack. The smell hit her first. It wasn't rot, not exactly, but old blood, metal, fear somehow in scent form. The vent cavity wasn't empty. It opened into a small, dark recess, deeper than she expected, hidden between the outer and inner walls of the house. She fumbled for her phone, turned on the flashlight, and aimed it inside. At first she saw nothing. Then movement, a flinch, a tremble. She gasped. There, curled in the furthest corner, pressed so tightly into itself it almost disappeared into the shadows, was a small dog. A terrier no more than 15 pounds. Mud-caked fur, blood-matted leg, a thin rope tied tight around its back legs. Its eyes reflected the light, golden and wet. It didn't growl. It didn't bark. It just looked at her. Sophia dropped to her knees. "Oh my God! Oh my God, baby, hold on." She reached in carefully, afraid to scare it further. But the dog didn't move. It had gone too long without believing in rescue. "Lily," she said urgently, "get the scissors, the ones we used on the duct tape. Hurry." Lily ran, no questions asked. By the time she returned, Sophia had both arms inside the wall, maneuvering gently. The dog was trembling. Bones beneath skin, every rib visible. There were patches where the fur was missing entirely. The smell of infection lingered in the air like a warning. She cut the rope. The dog let out a single soft, strangled whimper, like a breath that had waited years to be released. She pulled him free, cradling him to her chest, the blood seeping through her shirt. He didn't resist, just pressed his head into her collarbone and closed his eyes. Lily touched his paw gently. "He's been waiting for us." Sophia's throat tightened. "We need to get him to the vet, right now." She wrapped him in a towel and rushed to the truck, Lily beside her. The silence of the house seemed to deepen behind them, as if holding its breath. The drive into town felt longer than it was. Every bump on the road jolted the dog in her lap. He whimpered once, then went still again. The vet didn't ask questions at first, just action. IV fluids, antibiotics, pain management. He's severely dehydrated, malnourished. "But he's a fighter," the vet finally said, looking at Sophia with narrowed eyes. "Where did you find him?" Sophia hesitated. "In the wall." The vet blinked. "I'm sorry." "In the wall of the house we just moved into. Behind a painting." The silence that followed was thick. Lily stepped forward. "His name is Rusty," she said calmly. Sophia turned to her. "What?" "That's what he told me." No one in the room spoke. The beeping of the monitor filled the space where logic had stepped out. Sophia put a hand on Lily's shoulder. "You heard him." Lily nodded. He said, "Tell her I'm not mad. I just didn't want to die alone." The vet slowly sat down. Rusty stirred in Sophia's arms just slightly, a flick of the ear. Outside, the Texas sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Inside, something ancient, quiet, and wounded had begun to stir. And in the heart of a little girl, something invisible had just spoken and been heard. The walls of the old farmhouse had finally spoken. After the emergency visit to the vet, Sophia barely slept. Her shirt was stained with blood. The smell lingered on her skin even after 3 showers. She kept seeing his eyes, those golden human eyes, open, blinking, and waiting. Not barking, not fighting, just waiting. Rusty, as Lily had called him, named him, believed him to be, was stable but sedated. The vet, Dr. Mallory, a woman in her 60s with a no-nonsense tone, had looked at the dog like she'd seen a ghost. Sophia sat in the clinic's back room the next morning, Lily asleep on her lap, while Dr. Mallory gently lifted back the blood-matted fur and exposed the truth inch by inch. "This wasn't just neglect," she muttered. "This was deliberate, controlled, prolonged. There were rope burns, not just on the legs but across the torso. Deep bruises layered under the skin like fossils, some fresh, some years old. Scars in strange symmetrical places. One ear torn halfway. A rear leg that had once been broken and never healed properly. Sophia didn't need the full medical report to feel the gravity. Someone had hurt this dog and done it like a ritual. and someone had hidden him behind a wall. That thought haunted her all the way back to the farmhouse. Later that afternoon, she made the call to the sheriff's department. She didn't want to, but something about the way Lily kept looking at the now empty wall convinced her. The little girl didn't say much after they got back. She simply sat near the wall, holding her bunny, staring at the spot where the painting used to hang. When Deputy Callahan arrived, Sophia led him inside. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, more polite than curious at first, until he saw the vent. "You sure this wasn't just an animal got stuck?" he asked, already uncomfortable. Sophia didn't flinch. No, he was tied, bound, buried. Callahan crouched, tapping the edges. "Mind if I take a closer look?" She nodded. He pulled on gloves and pried at the vent frame, running his flashlight around the cavity. Then he stood, glanced at her. "You said you found him just inside here?" "Yes." "Did you go deeper?" Sophia frowned. "Deeper. There's drywall behind that. What you opened is just a maintenance gap. But this house has thick walls, brick. There might be more behind." Sophia's pulse quickened. "You think he was put further in?" "Can't say yet. But judging by what you're telling me, if he was in that bad shape, he couldn't have walked in there himself." Within 2 hours, a small team was on site. 2 officers, a forensics tech, and the town's only crime scene investigator, a woman named Terry with sunburned skin and sharp eyes. They cleared the living room furniture, measured, photographed, tapped on drywall like surgeons listening for a tumor. Then Terry found it. A section of wall just beside the fireplace sounded hollow, too hollow. Old plaster, no beam, just space. She marked it. Then, with a handheld oscillating saw, she made the first cut. The dust filled the air instantly like a scream trapped in powder. Behind the wall was a chamber. Not natural, not architectural. A compartment bricked in, hand-sealed. No access except from inside the house. And inside that cavity, they found blood. Not fresh, brown and dry. Sprayed on the inner side of the bricks in bursts, along with scratch marks clawed deeply into the surface. There were tufts of hair stuck between mortar seams, a piece of frayed rope, a rusted broken dog bowl with faded lettering. "Good boy." Everyone in the room froze. No one said a word. Then Callahan finally muttered, "Jesus Christ." Terry leaned in, hand trembling, and photographed the wall. Sophia stood back, arms wrapped around herself. He was buried alive. The words came out like someone else had spoken them, but no one disagreed. That night the scene was secured. Samples collected, blood swabbed, hair bagged. The entire wall was cordoned off with yellow tape. And Sophia was asked to stay elsewhere until the investigation was done. She and Lily checked into a motel in town. It didn't take long. The next morning, the sheriff himself called. We ran the samples through the animal cruelty registry. There's a match. Sophia gripped the phone tighter. To who? Not who. What, the dog? Her breath caught. You ID'd him. We think so. There was a case 5 years ago. National attention. A man was arrested for operating an illegal breeding compound. Allegations of dogfighting, torture, starvation. He had over 40 dogs. 27 survived. Just one disappeared. Media called him Ghost Dog because no one ever found the body. No remains. But there was blood. A lot of it. They assumed he was dead. Sophia sat down slowly. But he wasn't. No, ma'am. According to the vet's assessment, and this match he survived. And someone brought him here. Who owned this house back then? That's the next question. But this goes deeper than we thought. I've already contacted the State Cruelty Task Force. They're sending someone. By noon, the story had hit the local news. Dog found bricked behind wall in Texas farmhouse. Possible link to infamous abuse case. Reporters showed up by evening. Cameras, microphones, questions, and a stunned town that suddenly found itself holding the center of a story it had buried years ago. Sophia watched it unfold from the motel room. She shielded Lily from most of it, though the girl didn't seem disturbed. Just quiet, focused. She colored pictures of dogs on the motel notepad. One looked like Rusty, the other not. He wasn't alone, she said quietly, not looking up. What baby? Lily didn't answer. That evening, the vet called again. He's awake, Dr. Mallory said. Sophia rushed over, Lily in tow. When they arrived, Rusty was lying in a clean blanket, hooked to IVs, eyes open, but calm. He didn't flinch when Sophia approached. Didn't cower. He just stared at her. then at Lily. Sophia knelt beside him. "Hey, boy, you okay?" Rusty blinked once, slowly. He remembers Lily whispered. Sophia turned. Remembers what? He used to have a name, before Rusty. Sophia waited, but he doesn't want it anymore. Dr. Mallory stepped into the room. "He's responding better than I expected. But there's something else." She handed Sophia a small envelope. Inside were printed images, x-rays. "This isn't just a case of long-term abuse. Someone put something inside him." Sophia blinked. "What?" Dr. Mallory pointed to the scan. "That's a microchip. Old model. Not registered in any U.S. vet database. Could be foreign black market. It's partially damaged, but it's there. Can we trace it? Already working on it. But if I had to guess, someone didn't just hide him. They were watching him. Tracking him." Sophia felt her stomach twist. Who the hell would track a dog like this? And more importantly, why bury him alive, only to leave him with a chip? Something didn't make sense. None of it did. Back at the motel that night, Lily climbed into bed and asked, "Can Rusty stay with us?" Sophia looked at her. She didn't know what the future held. Whether the state would take him. Whether someone might claim ownership. Whether whoever did this was watching. But in that moment, none of it mattered. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, baby. We'll keep him safe now." Outside, lightning flashed far off over the Texas plains. Inside, the motel lamp flickered slightly. Rusty, 3 miles away at the clinic, lifted his head. Just once. And in the darkness of the old farmhouse behind the ruined wall, something else stirred. Something not quite finished. Under the flickering motel ceiling light, Sophia Hart lay awake. The TV was off. Lily was asleep beside her, curled up with her stuffed rabbit, its ears limp from years of love. And yet, the silence felt like a scream pressing against Sophia's ears. The kind of silence that dredged up memories you swore you'd buried deep. It wasn't just that dog, not just Rusty. It was the way he looked at her. The way he didn't look afraid. It was what Lily had said that afternoon at the clinic. Sophia hadn't wanted to repeat it out loud, but it played on a loop in her mind like a ticking clock. He said, "Don't be scared. He's not mad at people." Sophia had frozen when Lily said that. Not because it sounded strange coming from a 6-year-old, but because she'd heard those exact words before. 5 years ago, back when she was still Dr. Sophia Hart, DVM. Back when her scrubs were still clean, and her name hadn't yet been dragged across the headlines of veterinary malpractice forums. The case had come in like any other cruelty report, only this one didn't come from a neighbor or an anonymous tip. It came from a UPS driver who swore he heard screaming dogs inside a barn during a late delivery run to the edge of town. The sheriff's office raided the property 2 days later. It was a compound fenced, heavily wooded with layers of trash stacked along the drive. There were kennels, dozens, some still holding animals alive, others empty, with bones. Sophia had been called in as part of the emergency team to assess survivors. She remembered stepping into that barn. The thick smell of urine, blood, and hopelessness hit her like a wall. She remembered the eyes, dozens of them, staring out from cages too small for movement. Dogs of all breeds, all sizes, all broken in different ways. But one stall at the far back had been different, locked. Not with a latch, but a padlock. She remembered yelling for someone to bring bolt cutters. And when they did, and the door finally opened, what she saw inside wasn't just horror. It was intention, a single dog. Gray-white terrier mix, chained to a post. His body was still, but his eyes were wide open. There were fresh cuts on his flanks, likely from wire or glass. But it was his expression that haunted her. He wasn't growling, wasn't even cowering. He looked resigned, like he'd seen too much and expected worse. She'd knelt beside him, spoken gently. "It's okay, baby. You're safe now." And he, this same dog she now called Rusty, had blinked once. Then, as she reached to unclip the chain, someone yelled from outside. A man, screaming incoherently. That's when chaos erupted. The suspect had returned. Sophia remembered how quickly everything unraveled. The man was tall, wiry, with long white hair and a beard that looked like a tangled bird's nest. His clothes were filthy and his eyes were wild. He screamed about how they were his angels and how the outsiders had no right to touch them. She remembered how the deputies tackled him, how he spit and fought like a cornered animal, How he shouted a name again and again, Jonah, like it was some sacred chant. They arrested him, hauled him off, but that wasn't the end. That was just where it began to fall apart. The man's name was Eldridge Creel. He'd lived on that property for over 40 years. No family, no work history for the last 2 decades. Just a house inherited from a brother and a record of minor disturbances. When the case went to court, it was supposed to be open and shut. But something happened. Evidence went missing. Testimonies got retracted. One of the lead witnesses vanished, rumored to have fled the state. The case collapsed. Eldridge Creel was released pending further investigation. He never showed up for his next hearing, and just like that, he disappeared. No one could find him. Not in Texas, not anywhere. The local police said he was dead. Others said he ran into the woods and never came out. Sophia never got to finish her report. That night after the court let him go, someone broke into the shelter where the dogs had been transferred. 2 of them were stolen. 1 was killed. The building was set on fire. Only the sprinkler system saved it from total destruction. The administration panicked. They shut down the case, fired 3 staff members. Sophia, who had spoken publicly about the cruelty and the failures of the legal process, was offered 2 choices: retract or resign. She resigned, and she never looked back. Until now. Now 5 years later, she was holding the same dog in her arms. And her daughter, a child, who had never heard the story, who didn't even exist when it happened, had looked at him and said, he said, "Don't be scared. He's not mad at people." The same words Sophia had whispered to him that day in the barn. That night, she sat alone on the motel balcony, wrapped in a hotel blanket, a cup of bitter coffee untouched beside her. She thought about how Lily looked at Rusty, how Rusty looked at her, how calm he seemed in her presence, how he never barked, never flinched. He trusted her, and Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that Lily wasn't just imagining things. The next morning, after Lily was dressed and fed, they went back to the clinic. Dr. Mallory met them with furrowed brows and a printout in her hand. "We got something from the chip." Sophia stood still. "It's old tech," Mallory said. "But we ran it through an overseas registry. It was flagged." "Where?" Sophia asked. "Eastern Europe. Romania specifically. Registered to a research facility that shut down over a decade ago. The name on file was E. Creel." Sophia's heart nearly stopped. "Wait, Eldridge Creel. He used a chip from Europe." Mallory nodded. "And not just any chip. This one was military grade, programmable, capable of biometric tracking. No idea how he got his hands on it." Sophia stared at the floor. "He used that dog for experiments." "Not experiments," Mallory said softly. "For something else. Maybe surveillance, maybe punishment, maybe just control." Sophia looked at Rusty lying on the blanket, his eyes following Lily with quiet affection. "He was the one who got away," she whispered. "And someone wanted him buried so badly," Mallory added, "they sealed him inside a wall." That afternoon, Sophia drove out to the old shelter. It had been rebuilt, rebranded. But the walls were still the same. The kennels still rattled the same way in the wind. She stood outside watching the dogs play in the fenced yard and remembered the smell of that barn, the silence of Rusty's cage, the flames licking at the corners of justice and failing to burn it clean. She called the sheriff. "I want to give an official statement about the old case." There was a pause on the line. "You sure?" "I'm sure. I was there. I knew that dog. And I think we both know Eldridge didn't die." "You think he's still out there?" Sophia looked up at the sun squinting through the Texas haze. "No," she said. "I think he's closer than anyone realizes." When she returned to the motel, Lily was sitting by the window talking to someone. But there was no one there. "Who are you talking to, honey?" Sophia asked gently. Lily turned. "I was telling Jonah he doesn't have to be scared anymore," she said with a smile. Sophia's blood ran cold. "Jonah," Lily nodded. "That's what the other boy was called." Sophia dropped to her knees, gripping her daughter's shoulders. "What other boy?" "The one Rusty used to play with. He lived in the house before us. But he didn't make it out." Sophia felt the air drain from her lungs. "Did Rusty tell you that?" Lily shook her head. "No, the boy did." That night, Sophia couldn't sleep, because something old was bleeding back into her life. Because there were ghosts in that house. And because the worst wounds, the kind that came from injustice, never really healed. They just waited. For someone to return. For someone to remember. For someone to finally dig deep enough to set them free. The morning sun rose over the Carson farmhouse, casting long beams across the warped floorboards and through the smudged window panes like fingers prying open the past. Dew clung to the dying grass outside. But inside, something older than decay was stirring. Sophia stood in the living room again, arms crossed, staring at the hollow wall where Rusty had been found. The place felt different now. The silence wasn't silence anymore, it was waiting. Sheriff Mark Caldwell arrived with 2 crime scene technicians, their van idling out front. He was a practical man, mid-50s, with the kind of tired eyes only law enforcement and widowers carried. The first thing he did was ask Sophia to tell the story again, every detail slowly. When she finished, he knelt near the wall and ran his hand along the baseboard. "This house," he muttered, "has been hiding more than one secret." The technicians began scanning the living room with handheld UV lights, brushing powder along floor seams and testing for hidden stains. They didn't expect much. Most cases went cold before they even cooled. Then one of them called out, "Sheriff, you'll want to see this." Near the base of the wall, just beneath where the painting had hung, a faint outline had appeared. Not visible to the naked eye, only under ultraviolet, a trail of something dark that had soaked into the wood grain. Blood. Not recent, but not ancient either. It streaked outward in thin, uneven lines toward the center of the room, then stopped abruptly beneath an old rug. They rolled the rug back. A single warped floorboard stood out cracked lengthwise, subtly lifted on one edge. One of the techs wedged a crowbar beneath it, pried gently, and the board came up with a dry, reluctant groan. Dust exploded into the air. Beneath the plank was a hollow space, no insulation, no piping, just dirt. And in that dirt, more blood. They removed more boards, widening the hole until they hit concrete. Then something else, a rusted metal handle flush with the cement slab. A trapdoor. Everyone in the room froze. Caldwell signaled for backup before motioning to the others. "We're opening it. Stay sharp." They levered the trapdoor open with effort. Hinges screamed in protest, and a rush of stagnant air whooshed upward, like breath held too long. A narrow concrete stairwell led down into blackness. Flashlights clicked on. Sophia felt her heart lurch in her chest. "I'm going down with you," she said before Caldwell could object. He glanced at her. "You sure?" She nodded. "I've seen this before. I need to see how deep it goes." The air grew colder with every step. The basement beneath the farmhouse wasn't listed in the original property blueprints. It wasn't part of any county permit. Someone had added it quietly, secretly. The walls were concrete. Mold crept along the corners. The smell was thick earth, metal, old rot. Then their lights caught something that made everyone stop. Chains, not just one, but several hanging from hooks in the far wall. They rattled faintly as the air shifted. Next to them, a chewed metal food bowl, dented and rusted nearly through. And above it all, half buried in the wall's edge, the dead lens of a security camera. It had been smashed, shattered glass, and torn wiring exposed. But it was pointed at the chains, at the bowl, at whatever had once been tethered there. Sophia swallowed hard. This was a kennel, she whispered. A torture room. Caldwell stepped closer. Someone watched them, recorded them. One of the techs spoke, voice low. "There's no feed line." This wasn't broadcasting, just recording. Sophia stared at the camera. "Then where's the footage?" As they swept the room for clues, they discovered a broken crate near the back, splintered open, as if something had clawed its way out. Along the base of one wall was a trail scratches, deep, jagged lines that told a silent story of desperation. The flashlight beam landed on a nameplate half buried in dirt, Jonah. Sophia blinked. "That's the name Lily said yesterday." Caldwell turned. "You told me she mentioned that." "Yes," Sophia said, her voice tightening. "She said the boy Rusty used to play with was named Jonah." The silence returned heavier this time. The weight of possibility pressed down on everyone. Caldwell stood up straight. "We need to treat this as a crime scene connected to the Creel case. Lock it down. I want a full forensic sweep," Sheriff said, one tech quietly. "If that's the case, you should see this." He pointed toward the back of the basement, where something jutted from the concrete wall, metal piping, but not water or electrical. It had been sealed with tar. Sophia crouched, touching the surface. "That's air ventilation," she murmured. But not to let air in this was to keep it from smelling up. Caldwell's face hardened. He buried something down here. The implications were spiraling. Whoever had built this room had done so with intent. They hadn't just hidden dogs, they'd created a place to break them, train them, control them, or worse. And whoever Jonah had been, he may not have been a dog. Back upstairs, the living room was quiet again, but not safe. Sophia stood at the window, staring out at the tree line that circled the property. Something shifted behind the bark behind the leaves. Something still watched. That evening, the forensics team unearthed more disturbing evidence. In a crawl space beneath the staircase, they found boxes. Dozens of them. Each marked with dates, years spanning over 2 decades. Inside tapes, old VHS tapes neatly labeled. Some said only S, others T1, T2, T3, and so on. Sophia opened one, a dogfight. Brutal, and recorded without hesitation. Another, a young boy blindfolded holding a leash. Another, and another. Some tapes had been burned, damaged, but many were intact. The sheriff ordered them seized and sent to the FBI. The case had now crossed into something bigger, something that hinted at a network, not just a lone man. But what unsettled Sophia the most was what hadn't been found. There was no sign of who had lived here since the last recorded sale. No tax records, no forwarding addresses, no signatures. Creel had owned it decades ago, but after his arrest, it was sold under a trust, one that now traced to a shell company in Arkansas, completely anonymous. Sophia sat on the porch that night, her arms wrapped around herself. The air was cool but not refreshing. She kept thinking about Lily's words. He's not mad at people. No animal tortured like that should be capable of forgiveness. But maybe Rusty hadn't forgiven everyone, just Lily. Maybe only children could still see truth. The next morning, Caldwell returned. We ran prints from the chain collar found in the wall, he said, setting down a file. They matched someone in the old Creel case. A deputy. Sophia stared at him. Deputy Patrick Allen. He was one of the first responders to the Creel compound 5 years ago. Disappeared from the force after being accused of destroying evidence. Charges were dropped. He vanished. Her stomach turned. You think he's connected to this house? I think he never left. Or maybe he came back. They both turned to look at the woods. You said Lily's window faces that side of the property? Caldwell asked. Yes, why? Because last night, he said grimly, a neighbor called in a report. What kind of report? Motion detected at the edge of your tree line. Human figure? Large? Stayed for 10 minutes. Then disappeared. Sophia's mouth went dry. He added, and we found cigarette butts. Still warm. Someone's watching. Sophia stared into the forest, her breath shallow. What do we do now? She asked. Caldwell didn't blink. We dig deeper. And we don't stop until we pull every secret out of this place. She nodded, but as she turned to go inside, something caught her eye. A shape. A dark smudge in the upper window. Then it moved. Sophia looked again, but the glass was empty, and the house had returned to stillness. But in the walls and the floorboards, in the echo of chains, the past wasn't buried. Not yet. And whatever or whoever had once watched from the dark was watching still. The clinic room smelled like antiseptic and silence. Rusty lay on a padded blanket inside a large kennel. Eyes half open, breathing steady. His leg was bandaged, IV still connected, but the shivering had stopped. He hadn't barked once. Not when the vet touched him, not during the injections, not even when another dog howled down the hall. He was quiet, unnaturally so. Dr. Mallory had said some animals lose their voice from trauma. Not just physical damage. Deep trauma. It's like the sound is afraid to come out. But when Lily walked into the room, something shifted. Sophia noticed at first the twitch in Rusty's ear, the slight lift of his head. And then the tail barely moving, but moving nonetheless. Hi, Lily, whispered, crouching near the kennel. She didn't reach inside. She just sat cross-legged on the tile floor, hands folded, eyes soft. I'm back. Rusty lifted his head fully. His gaze met hers, like a magnet settling into place. The kind of look that didn't just recognize, it remembered. Sophia stood quietly at the door, arms crossed. I told Mommy about the hill, Lily said softly. The one behind the house, with the rocks shaped like hearts. Rusty tilted his head. I told her that's where Jonah used to take you. Before the bad man came. Sophia swallowed hard. Lily, she said gently, where did you hear that name again? Lily didn't look away from Rusty. He told me. Rusty told you? Lily nodded. In my dream. But it wasn't just a dream. It was one of those dreams that feel real in your skin. Sophia stepped forward. And what did he say exactly? Lily turned her head finally, her voice calm but certain. He said he used to play fetch up there, that Jonah used to make up stories about clouds, and that the bad man didn't like laughter. Sophia felt a chill slither up her back. Did Rusty tell you that in words? Lily shook her head. Not in words. In feelings. Pictures. Like a movie inside my head. But I could understand him, like he was talking through my heart. Dr. Mallory had entered the room silently behind them. That kind of connection isn't impossible, she said quietly. Some kids, they're just open in ways adults aren't. They feel things clearer. Sophia turned. Are you saying she's psychic? I'm saying trauma has strange conduits, especially when it passes from one soul to another. That night, back at the motel, Sophia sat with her laptop open, reading through archived reports on the Creel case, searching for anything about the name Jonah. There was nothing in the official files. No mention of a child, no photos of boys, just dogs, chains fire. But then she stumbled across an old forum post, one of hundreds from the public outrage that followed the case's collapse. This one was written by a woman who claimed to be the niece of Eldridge Creel's late brother. In the comments she wrote, I remember visiting the farm when I was little. There was always this boy, Jonah, I think never talked much. My mom said he wasn't family, but he lived there. She thought he was adopted or taken in. Maybe I only met him twice. He liked dogs. But then one day, he was just gone. Sophia leaned back in her chair. Her pulse raced. The comment was dated 7 years ago. So the boy was real. Not just a figment, not just Lily's invention. She glanced at the motel bed where her daughter was now asleep, her hand resting on Rusty's fur. The dog had curled beside her without hesitation, body relaxed in a way it never was at the clinic. Sophia whispered to herself, what are you? The next morning, they drove back to the house. Sophia had cleared it with Caldwell. The forensic team was gone for now, and the living room was no longer sealed. Rusty rode in the back seat, curled on a blanket, staring out the window with calm, unblinking focus. He didn't whine. He didn't pant. He simply watched. They arrived just after 9 a.m. Lily led the way. Instead of going inside, she walked toward the back of the property. Behind the barn, past the overgrown chicken coop, there was a faint trail hard to see unless you were looking. She was. The path was narrow, tangled with weeds, branches clawing at their clothes. Sophia followed silently, heart hammering in her chest. Rusty trotted ahead, his limp more stable now, his tail just slightly raised. After nearly 15 minutes, they reached it. A clearing, circular, silent, and surrounded by oaks. In the center was a natural mound of earth, flat on top, with large stones scattered around its edge. One of them, larger than the rest, had been chipped into the shape of a half-heart. Lily walked straight to it, knelt down and placed her palm against the stone. Rusty stopped behind her, sat and lowered his head as if in reverence. Sophia said nothing. Then Lily looked up. This was their place. Who's Jonah and Rusty? Before everything went dark. Sophia knelt beside her daughter, placing a hand on her back. He said the sky was always blue here, Lily continued. That when the bad things started, he tried to come back to this place. But they were locked up, both of them. Sophia looked around the clearing. There was no sign of human activity, no trash, no footprints. And yet the silence here wasn't oppressive. It was sacred. Why did he bring us here? Sophia asked, more to the wind than anyone else. Lily answered, her voice far away. So you'd know the story didn't end in the basement. They sat in the clearing for a long time. Rusty lay beside them, one paw touching Lily's shoe. That evening, back at the house, Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, not just in Rusty, but in Lily. Her daughter spoke less now, but when she did, it was with eerie certainty. As they settled into the living room, the fireplace cold, Sophia turned to Lily. Sweetheart, can I ask you something? Lily nodded. When Rusty talks to you, do you ever feel scared? Lily shook her head. No, because he's not scary. He's sad, but not dangerous. Sophia hesitated. And Jonah? Lily paused. He's watching, but he's not stuck. Not anymore. He just wanted someone to tell his story. Someone who would listen. Sophia felt something crack open in her chest. A realization she hadn't been ready to accept. This wasn't imagination. This wasn't just a girl and a rescued dog. This was communion. That night, she dreamed of the hill. of a boy with sandy hair and a crooked smile running through the grass, a Java leaping beside him. She saw the sky blue impossibly so, and the trees opening like curtains around them. Then fire, then chains, then silence. She woke in tears. Rusty was curled beside her, his eyes open, watching, knowing. The late afternoon sun bled through the cracked glass panes of the Carson farmhouse, turning the dust in the air to golden haze. Outside, the wind rattled dry leaves across the porch. Inside, the house held its breath. Sophia was in the kitchen washing dishes when Lily appeared silently in the doorway. "I want to show you something," the little girl said, her voice calm. Too calm. Sophia dried her hands, already uneasy. "What is it, baby?" "The room upstairs. I dreamed about it last night, but I think it's real." Sophia followed her daughter up the narrow staircase. Rusty padded behind them, tail low, ears alert. The house creaked with every step as if protesting their movement. They stopped at the end of the hallway, a dead end, nothing but a blank wall and a rusted coat hook, but Lily pointed upward. "There's a ladder in the ceiling." Sophia frowned. She'd never noticed it before. Lily reached up and tugged. With a groan, a square of ceiling gave way, and a wooden ladder descended slowly, each rung groaning under its own weight. They climbed. The attic was colder than expected. Dust clung to every surface. Wooden beams stretched across the space like the ribs of some dead creature. It smelled of time, dry rot, old paper, and something faintly metallic. And paintings, dozens of them, lining the walls, stacked in rows, leaning against boxes. Sophia moved slowly, brushing cobwebs away, staring at each canvas. They were wrong, uneven, distorted. Some showed nothing but twisted trees and black ink. Others were of the farmhouse, but slightly altered. The windows were all dark. The sky was always gray. There were no people, until the last row. These were smaller. Children's drawings, but disturbingly precise. One showed a small boy with blonde hair standing on a hill holding the paw of a dog. The dog's fur was gray and white, just like Rusty's. The boy's eyes were hollow circles, but they smiled. Another showed the farmhouse. A figure stood at the attic window watching something in the yard. And another, this one, different from the rest, was vivid with color. It showed the boy and the dog again, but they were inside a cage. The background was blood red. Lily stood before it without blinking. "That's Jonah," she said. "And Rusty." Sophia's heart stuttered. "You've never seen this before." "No," Lily said, "but I remember it." Sophia knelt beside her, studying the signature in the corner. A child's handwriting. Just one name. Jonah, 1983. Sophia whispered it aloud, tasting the name like a ghost on her tongue. "He was here." Rusty whined softly, his nose pressed to a large chest in the corner. Sophia walked over, brushed aside a layer of old blankets, and lifted the lid. Inside were notebooks, hand-bound, yellowing and nearly falling apart. She picked one up and flipped it open. The handwriting was shaky at first, then steadier, small, precise block letters. June 4th, 1983. Rusty learned how to open the gate. I think he's smarter than a regular dog. He understands when I talk. Sometimes I hear him before I say anything. Not like words, more like feelings. I don't tell Grandpa. He'd make me give him back. Sophia flipped further. July 17th. Grandpa said I need to be tough. He made me watch him hurt one of the puppies. I wanted to run, but I didn't. I held Rusty so he wouldn't bark. He didn't. He just shook. I hate this place. Another. August 3rd. Rusty told me about the hill again. I think he wants us to go there. He says it's safe there. I want to believe him. And then, August 9th. Grandpa found the hill. He was mad. He locked Rusty in the basement. I tried to sneak food, but he caught me. He said if I disobey again, he'll bury Rusty in the wall. Sophia closed the notebook, trembling. There were 8 more. She opened the next one. August 15th. There's a hole behind the chimney upstairs. I think I can fit Rusty through if I can get him out. I drew a map just in case. If anyone finds this, please don't let him forget me. Sophia looked up at Lily. The little girl was staring into space, her lips moving slightly. "What is it?" Sophia asked. Lily blinked slowly. "He said, it's not your fault. He says you tried." Sophia's eyes filled. "Lily, who are you talking to?" "The boy." A silence fell between them, heavy and strange. He's not stuck anymore, Lily continued. But he wants us to finish it. Finish what? Lily looked at her with eyes far older than 6. The story. So no one forgets him. Or Rusty. Or what happened here. Sophia reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's forehead. We won't forget him, baby. I promise. That night, Sophia sat alone in the attic, flipping through every page of every notebook. She learned that Jonah had been brought to the farm after his parents died in a car crash. No one claimed him. Somehow Eldridge Creel became his legal guardian, though no paperwork was ever filed officially. Jonah described a daily life of silence commands isolation and love. He loved Rusty, called him my brother with fur, said he was the only one who didn't lie with his eyes. Sophia read until her eyes blurred. One entry stood out, August 22nd. Grandpa said I'm old enough now, old enough to understand why the dogs are punished. He said they teach us how to obey. But I don't want to learn anymore. I'm going to run. I have to try. Rusty said he'll help. That was the last entry. Sophia didn't sleep that night. She stayed in the attic, surrounded by drawings, journals, and a pain that had waited 40 years for a witness. When morning came, she found Lily already awake, sitting in the living room, Rusty curled at her feet. He says, "Thank you," Lily said. For what? For remembering. Sophia knelt and took her daughter's hands. I'm going to the sheriff. I'm going to tell him everything. Lily nodded. And then what? She asked. Sophia looked down at Rusty. Then she said, we finished the story. The sun refused to rise that morning. Clouds blanketed the sky in a dull, bruised gray, and the wind pushed dry air across the land with a whisper too close to a voice. Sophia stood at the edge of the porch, Lily beside her. Rusty curled by her boots, silent as always. They had spent the night with Jonah's journal pages spread across the dining table, like the pieces of a crime scene only hearts could fully interpret. Sophia hadn't slept. She had read and reread every line, every secret. The pieces had finally come together, but the picture they formed was darker than anything she had imagined. The boy hadn't just lived here, he had died here. And the man who raised him, the man who had taught him that cruelty was discipline and obedience was survival, was no myth. Eldridge Creel had been real, and he had been a monster. Sophia clutched the notebook in her hands as she walked into the sheriff's office, hair pulled back, eyes hollow. She dropped the journal on Sheriff Caldwell's desk like a bomb. Read it, she said. He opened the first page and began flipping through the contents, his expression darkening with each line. Sophia stood silent, waiting. When he reached the final page, he leaned back, exhaling slowly. I thought this was just a rumor, he muttered. The boy. Jonah. He was real, Sophia said. And he didn't run away. He didn't get adopted. He died here, in that house. Caldwell looked up. How can you be sure? Sophia pulled a small sketch from her back pocket. A crude child's drawing of a round stone circle behind the barn with a single word written beneath it in block letters. I want you to search the well behind the house, she said. You'll find him there. Caldwell hesitated, studying her face. That well's been dried out since the 90s. We always thought. You always thought wrong, she interrupted. That afternoon, a team of deputies arrived at the Carson property with ground-penetrating radar and excavation tools. Lily stayed inside with Rusty as Sophia watched from the porch arms folded so tightly it felt like they were the only thing keeping her upright. The moment the first brick was lifted from the rim of the forgotten well, the air changed. A stench began to rise, faint at first, then undeniable. The kind of smell the earth tried to forget. 30 feet down, buried beneath rotted boards and dirt, they found the remains. A small skeleton curled against the stones. Fragments of denim, a torn shoe, and a collar still attached to a tiny dog harness, but no dog. Sophia clutched the railing until her knuckles went white. Jesus, one of the deputies whispered. It's a kid. Caldwell crouched by the well's edge, removing his hat, head lowered. The forensics team worked quietly with reverence. By sundown, the remains had been recovered, labeled, and transported. The well was taped off the surrounding area, turned into a restricted zone. Caldwell returned to Sophia with something wrapped in a sealed evidence bag. Found this next to him, he said softly. Inside the bag was a notebook, almost completely destroyed by water damage. But a few words remained. Scrawled in faded ink, I just wanted him to be free. Even if I couldn't be. Sophia's throat closed. She didn't speak. Inside the house, Lily was waiting at the kitchen table. He's not cold anymore, she said when Sophia walked in. He says he remembers the sunlight. He said thank you. Sophia dropped to her knees, pulling her daughter into a trembling hug. Is he gone? Lily whispered. I don't know, Sophia said, pressing her face into Lily's shoulder. But I think part of him has finally been found. That night, Caldwell called. They're confirming it's a boy around 10 years old. The timeline matches. We'll have a DNA result in a few days. Will it be enough? Sophia asked. To charge Creel. If he's alive, maybe, Caldwell said. But I think the truth's bigger than just Creel. Sophia sat in silence for a moment. He used the dogs to teach the boy obedience, she finally said. He trained them the way he wanted to train Jonah. And when Jonah rebelled, he killed him. Caldwell didn't deny it. I've seen that kind of man before, he said. Thinks he's the righteous hand of God. Justifies every bruise as a lesson. Every scream is part of the plan. Then what do we do now? We find out who else knew, who helped him, and who might still be watching. That evening, Sophia walked back out to the hill behind the barn with Lily and Rusty at her side. The clouds were beginning to clear. The sky opened up just enough to let a few stars shine through. They stopped at the center of the clearing. Lily reached down and picked up a smooth stone, wiped the dust from it, and laid it gently beside the largest one, the half-heart stone. Now he's not alone, she said. Rusty lay down at her feet. His eyes were open. Still. But there was peace in them now. Sophia looked out over the land wind, catching her hair. There's something else I need to tell you, Lily said suddenly. Sophia turned. What is it? He knew you, Lily said. Back then, when you came to help the dogs. Sophia's breath caught. What? He remembered your voice. He said you were kind. You didn't look away. The words hit her like a wave. She remembered. Just one moment from years ago, kneeling in a barn, whispering soft words to a child she didn't know was there. A flash of blonde hair behind a row of kennels. A hand quickly pulled back into shadow. I tried, Sophia whispered. I swear I tried. Lily nodded. He knows. They stayed on the hill until the cold crept into their bones. When they returned to the house, Sophia sat by the fire, staring into the flames. Rusty curled beside her eyes, closing slowly. She reached out and stroked his fur. Your boy made sure you weren't forgotten, she whispered. Now it's our turn. Because sometimes justice doesn't come from courts. Sometimes it comes from a little girl and a dog who never stopped waiting. The silence that had wrapped around the Carson farmhouse since the discovery of Jonah's remains had begun to shift. It wasn't relief. It was that dangerous, hollow quiet, the kind that comes just before a storm breaks loose from the sky. Sheriff Caldwell had promised a perimeter check, promised increased patrol, promised the past was over. But on the fourth night, Sophia knew something was wrong. It began with the motion sensor. They had installed it 2 days earlier, a simple camera above the back porch. Caldwell's team had set it up, trained it toward the edge of the woods, just in case. At 2:41 a.m., it triggered. The camera didn't beep. It didn't flash. But it recorded. A shape moved through the trees. Slow, deliberate, tall. The outline of a man. He stepped into view for only 3 seconds, his head tilted toward the lens. Then he vanished. No face, no details, just shadow. When Sophia woke that morning and checked the feed, the breath caught in her throat. She stared at the timestamp, replayed it 4 times. Her fingers trembled as she dialed Caldwell. He was there within the hour. They reviewed the footage together. You think it's him? She asked. Caldwell didn't answer at first. He kept staring at the screen. I've seen that posture before, he finally said. In the courtroom. In the barn. That tilt of the head like he's measuring your fear. Creel, I thought he was dead. Hell, I wanted to believe it. Sophia stood pacing the room. Then where has he been for the last 5 years? Maybe right here, Caldwell said grimly. Or nearby. Hiding in the woods. Watching. Sophia looked toward the trees beyond the window. For the first time, they didn't look like nature. They looked like camouflage. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat in the living room, lights off, Rusty beside her, his ears twitching. At 3:09 a.m., he stood. No sound had been made. No movement on the porch. But Rusty stood head low, body tense. Sophia rose slowly, grabbed the flashlight, and moved toward the door. When she stepped outside, the wind had died. She aimed the beam across the yard. Nothing. Then she looked down. Footprints, fresh, pressed into the dewy grass just beyond the porch. Heavy, male-sized, leading around the side of the house toward the basement door. She followed them, heart hammering. The basement door, always kept locked with a rusted latch, was ajar. Sophia froze. Her mind screamed to run, but something stronger rooted her in place. She stepped closer. The door creaked inward with a sound like a breath held too long. She shined the flashlight down the stairwell. It was empty. But the air was wrong. Cold, rotten. Rusty stood beside her, not barking but vibrating with tension. She stepped down slowly, her footfalls like thunder in the dark. When she reached the bottom, her beam fell on the far wall, and something moved. A man, thin, wild-haired, his clothes layered with grime and camouflage. He turned slowly to face her. And for the first time in decades, Sophia Hart looked into the eyes of Eldridge Creel. His skin was sun-leathered, cheeks hollow, but his gaze was bright with madness. "You found the boy," he said, voice hoarse. Sophia didn't answer. "You shouldn't have done that." She kept the light trained on him. "You buried him in the well." He smiled. "I set him free." Rusty growled low behind her. Creel stepped forward. "That thing isn't a dog," he hissed. "It's a vessel. A memory trap. Everything I tried to burn out of him, it clung to that mutt. That thing isn't loyal. It's cursed." Sophia didn't flinch. "You tortured him. You tortured them both." He pointed at her, trembling with rage. "You don't know what obedience means. That boy..." He laughed when he shouldn't have. "He touched things that weren't his. He disobeyed. I gave him a place, a purpose. You gave him a grave." Creel's smile twisted. "No. He chose it. He chose to lie, to steal. He put himself in that well." Sophia's voice broke sharp. "You locked him away because he loved something you couldn't control." Creel's face darkened. Behind them, Rusty stepped into the room, his body low, eyes fixed on the man who had tried to erase him from history. Creel saw him and faltered. "I buried you," he whispered. "I heard the rocks fall. You stopped breathing." Rusty stepped closer, slow and certain. Creel stumbled back. "I buried you," he screamed. And Rusty stopped, not out of fear, out of mercy. Sophia raised her phone and hit the record button. "You're going to tell the truth now," she said. But Creel wasn't listening anymore. He pressed his back to the wall, eyes wide. "You don't understand," he muttered. "That dog, he's not just remembering. He's remembering for Jonah. He's keeping it alive." Sophia stepped forward. "Good, because we're going to make sure the world remembers too." Creel lunged, fast for his age, wild with desperation. But Rusty met him halfway, not with teeth, not with violence. He leapt between them and stood his ground. Creel froze. The air trembled. Sophia saw it just for a second. The outline of a boy, faint, behind Rusty, watching. Then it was gone. Creel dropped to his knees. Tears welled in his eyes, not sorrow, rage. "You don't get it," he whispered. "He was supposed to be perfect, obedient. He was supposed to learn." Sophia looked down at him with nothing left to give. "You taught him how to die," she said. "But he taught Rusty how to live." Sirens wailed in the distance. Sheriff Caldwell and his team arrived moments later. They found Sophia standing in the basement doorway, flashlight in hand, Rusty beside her, eyes glowing in the dark. They found Creel on the floor, hands raised, muttering nonsense to himself. "I buried him," he kept saying. "He wasn't supposed to come back." Caldwell cuffed him, read him his rights, and the man who had haunted the woods, the walls, and a child's grave was finally dragged into the light. That morning, Sophia stood on the porch again. Rusty sat beside her, his body still but his eyes following the horizon. Lily stepped out, hair messy from sleep. "Is he gone?" she asked. Sophia looked at her daughter. "Yes, baby, he's gone." Lily knelt and hugged Rusty, whispering into his fur. Then she looked up at the sky. "He's free now," she said. Sophia didn't ask who. She already knew. Jonah was gone, but he'd never be forgotten. Because a little girl had heard his story, and a dog had refused to let it die. The wind screamed across the Texas plain, bending the tall grass like waves. Night had swallowed the last remnants of sunlight, and the farmhouse sat in the dark like a forgotten tomb. Inside, everything was still. Sophia had barricaded the doors after the sheriff left with Creel in cuffs. But something felt unfinished, off-kilter, like a chord struck without resolution. She tried to sleep. Lily curled beside her, Rusty at the foot of the bed. But just after 1:00 a.m., Rusty stirred. No growl, no whimper. He stood, ears angled toward the hallway, body rigid. Sophia sat up instantly. The air shifted, a draft, a sound, floorboards under pressure, and then the whisper of a hinge turning. Not in her imagination. The back door was opening. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She grabbed her phone. No signal. She looked down at Lily, still asleep, peaceful, unaware of the horror rising around them again. Sophia stood and tiptoed to the hallway, every step loaded with dread. Rusty followed silently. From the living room came the unmistakable sound of movement, slow, deliberate. Wood creaked under the weight of something heavy. Then a shadow moved across the wall. Sophia ducked back, grabbing Lily from the bed and clutching her close. She pressed her lips to the girl's ear. "Stay quiet. We're going out the window." "But Mommy, now!" She yanked the curtain, unlocked the latch, and shoved the window open. Cool air rushed in. She pushed Lily out onto the ledge, then climbed after her, pulling the window closed as softly as possible. From inside came a thud. A table knocked over. Then silence again. They crawled across the roof shingles, rough beneath their hands. Sophia guided Lily toward the lowest eave above the back shed. Rusty stayed behind, not moving. "Rusty, come," she whispered. But he didn't. He was watching the window tail, still, eyes fixed. Sophia hesitated, then turned back toward Lily. They dropped down into the tall grass behind the barn, thudding softly, knees buckling. Sophia helped Lily up, then grabbed her hand. They ran. No flashlight, just moonlight and panic. Their footsteps crushed the grass, hearts pounding in sync. Behind them, something moved. Footsteps. Closer than they should have been. Sophia turned a sharp corner around the old silo, pulling Lily into the shadow. They crouched there, breath shallow, hands pressed to mouths. And then she heard it. A voice. "I warned you." Not shouted. Spoken. Calm. Close. Creel. He wasn't in custody. Or if he had been, he had escaped. He was back. "You don't understand," he murmured. "That thing you're protecting, it doesn't forget. It doesn't forgive." Sophia held Lily close, heart thudding like war drums in her chest. She looked around, no weapons. Nothing but dirt and dark. Then footsteps again, moving past them. They waited. 10 seconds, 20. Silence. Sophia motioned to move again, leading Lily along the fence line toward the side gate. But Creel was waiting. He stepped from the shadows like he'd never left them. Eyes, wild breath, ragged something glinting in his hand, a rusted blade jagged and chipped. "I warned you," he repeated, stepping forward. Sophia threw herself between him and Lily. "Don't touch her." "I don't want the girl," he hissed. "I want the mutt." Then, a blur of gray. "Rusty." He hit Creel with surprising force, knocking the old man off balance, sending him stumbling back into the grass. Sophia screamed, "Run!" She grabbed Lily and bolted toward the barn, dragging her daughter with her, flinging open the door and slamming it shut behind them. Darkness. They crouched behind hay bales, gasping, listening. Outside, Rusty barked. For the first time in days, he barked. A deep guttural sound torn from the heart of an animal who had survived hell and come back with fury. But it was cut short by a yelp. Sophia's blood froze. She peeked through a crack in the wood. Rusty was on the ground. Creel stood above him, knife in hand, panting. "No more games," he growled. Sophia looked down at Lily. "I need you to stay here." "No," Lily sobbed. "Don't leave." "I'm coming back," she whispered. "But I need you safe. Hide. And if anything happens, run to the hill. Don't stop. Just run." Lily nodded through tears. Sophia grabbed the rusted pitchfork from the barn wall and pushed open the door. Creel turned as she charged. He was faster than she expected, ducking, slashing out with the blade. It grazed her arm, hot and sharp. But she didn't stop. She slammed the pitchfork toward him, catching his shoulder. He screamed, staggering back, dropping the knife. She lunged again, this time knocking him to the ground. Rusty struggled to his feet, blood on his side. Sophia knelt beside him, tears in her eyes. "You held on, just a little longer." Creel groaned behind them. Sophia turned, ready to strike. But Lily was there, standing in the barn doorway, holding the knife he had dropped. Eyes steady. "Leave us alone," she said. Creel sat up, blood on his shirt, laughing through his pain. "You don't know what that thing really is," he spat. "It's not love. It's a curse." "No," Lily said quietly. "You are." Sophia moved fast. She tackled him from behind, grabbed the knife from Lily, and drove the butt of it into Creel's temple. He collapsed, unconscious. Rusty whimpered, collapsing again. Sophia dropped to her knees. No, stay with me." Lily crouched beside them. "He says it's okay." Sophia sobbed, pressing her hands to Rusty's fur, feeling his chest rise and fall. "He says it's not your fault," Lily whispered. Sirens in the distance. This time they were coming. Sophia cradled Rusty's head in her lap, and for the first time since she was a little girl, she prayed. Not for punishment, but for healing. It was the kind of morning that felt like a second chance. Soft mist hung over the edges of the pasture, the sunlight still pale and unsure as it filtered through the trees. The Carson farmhouse stood silent, but changed. Not haunted, not hollow. just quiet now, like something that had finally exhaled. The nightmare was over. Eldridge Creel had been arrested, formally charged not only for animal cruelty, but for the murder of Jonah Ward, whose identity, once reduced to a handful of journal pages and a nameless grave, had now been fully confirmed through forensic DNA and community investigation. His story was in the papers, on the news, and in the hearts of the town that had once looked away. 40 years of silence undone by a little girl, a dog, and a mother who finally listened. Sophia sat in the waiting room of the animal clinic, her hands wrung tightly in her lap. Across the hall behind a glass door, Rusty lay on a heating pad, a light blanket covering his side. His ribs had been bruised in the struggle. One paw was fractured, but he had survived. Again, Lily was inside the room with him. She refused to sit anywhere else. Sophia watched through the window as her daughter gently brushed her fingers through Rusty's fur, whispering something only they could understand. The clinic was closed to the public that morning. Reporters had camped outside since dawn, but Sophia had refused interviews. Not yet. Not until the only witness that truly mattered was safe. Dr. Mallory emerged from the back room, removing her gloves. "He's stable, eating again. He even licked my hand this morning." Sophia smiled faintly. "He only does that for Lily?" Mallory nodded. "Some animals aren't just survivors. They're connectors. They hold memories that people forget. They carry pain across generations, and healing too when it's time." Sophia looked through the glass again. Lily was speaking now, her face close to Rusty's ear. "Thank you," she whispered. "You waited long enough." Rusty blinked slowly. His tail moved barely. A quiet, exhausted wag. "You brought him home," Lily added. "You brought him back." Sophia leaned against the doorframe, eyes glassy. She didn't interrupt. Outside, something remarkable was happening. The town, once fractured, fearful, dismissive, was coming together in a way it hadn't in decades. Volunteers cleaned up the old shelter where Jonah had once tried to hide the dogs. Donations flooded in from across the state. A memorial was planned at the hill where Jonah and Rusty had once played. People brought flowers, candles, drawings from their children. One little girl left a note written in crayon for the boy who loved the dog. "You are not forgotten." Inside the recovery room, Lily reached into her coat pocket and pulled out something small. A single piece of string frayed at both ends. She tied it gently around Rusty's paw like a bracelet. "It was Jonah's," she told him. "He said you kept it for him." Rusty closed his eyes, his breath even. That night back at the farmhouse, Lily curled into bed beside Sophia. "Is Rusty gonna be okay?" she asked softly. "Yes," Sophia said. "Dr. Mallory said he just needs time." Lily nodded, then yawned. "But he's tired," she murmured. "He carried the whole story on his back." Sophia stroked her hair. "You helped him carry it?" Lily didn't respond. Within moments, she was asleep, and she began to dream. The hill was glowing, not with sunlight, but something softer, like the kind of light dreams understand, even when the eyes can't. Lily stood at the top barefoot in the grass, her white nightgown fluttering in a breeze that didn't stir the trees. Ahead of her, two figures waited. One was Rusty, standing tall and uninjured, his fur clean, his body strong. The other was a boy 10 years old, maybe less. Blonde hair, bright eyes, a smile that didn't carry pain anymore. "Jonah." He turned to face her, holding Rusty's paw like a handshake that never had to end. "I remember you," Lily said in the dream. Jonah nodded. "You're safe now." He looked down at Rusty, then back at her. "So is he." Lily stepped forward. "Will I see you again?" "Not like this," Jonah said, "but I'll be around." Then he pointed toward the edge of the clearing. "You need to wake up now," he said gently. "Why?" "Because Rusty wants to see you with his eyes open." Lily looked down. The grass had begun to glow, two lights spreading outward from the two of them, like dawn breaking through sorrow. She stepped back, nodding. "Tell him I love him." "You already did." Jonah smiled. And just like that, the dream faded. The next morning, Lily opened her eyes to find Rusty staring at her, wide awake. His tail thumped once, then again. She laughed, a sound that cut through the silence like wind chimes in spring. "Mommy," she yelled. "He's awake." Sophia ran into the room, heart in her throat. And there he was, alive, present, looking at them like he'd always known they'd come back for him. Later that day, Sophia took Lily and Rusty to the hill. This time they brought something with them. A wooden sign, hand-carved, simple. They planted it in the ground, where the large heart-shaped stone rested. It read, "In memory of Jonah Ward and Rusty. Friends beyond time. Love beyond cruelty. Not forgotten." Lily sat beside the stone, Rusty lying across her lap. A wind rolled through the grass, like breath through lungs. Sophia stood with her hand on the sign, her other hand over her heart. They didn't speak. They didn't have to, because in that moment something healed. Something unspoken, ancient, wounds that didn't belong to them. Wounds carried by time, by blood, by memory closed just enough to let the light in. That night, Sophia sat on the porch as dusk fell. Lily was asleep inside. Rusty lay at her feet. She looked up at the stars. They were brighter than they'd been in weeks, maybe longer. And for the first time, she whispered something she hadn't said aloud in years. Thank you, to the boy, to the dog, to whatever force had given them both a voice again. She looked down at Rusty. He blinked slowly, then pressed his head against her knee. And together under the Texas sky, they kept watch. Not over danger, but over peace. Finally earned, and never forgotten. By late autumn, the Carson farm had changed. Not just the paint, or the new fence posts, or the way the wind moved across the fields. But something in its soul had shifted. What was once a house of silence and buried screams now carried laughter through its open windows. The ghosts hadn't been chased out. They'd been heard, and that had made all the difference. Sophia stood near the front gate watching volunteers unload crates of supplies, bags of kibble, new collars, soft blankets. Beside her was a brand new wooden sign just mounted that morning. Warden Rusty Animal Sanctuary, where the forgotten become family. She never thought she'd come back to veterinary work. After the fallout from the Creel case years ago, she had lost her faith in systems and people in herself. But what she witnessed in that house, what she survived alongside Lily and Rusty, had rewritten something inside her. The community hadn't just shown support. They'd stepped up. Townspeople offered their time. Vets from across the state volunteered for weekend rotations. Donors from as far as New York sent in grants tagging their letters with the same words repeated across headlines, the miracle behind the painting. It had started with one photo, Lily sitting on the front porch with Rusty beside her the morning after he woke up. A local reporter caught the shot without them noticing, sunlight catching Lily's hair like a halo. Rusty's gaze distant and wise, like a soul returned from war. That photo went viral. Then came the articles. A child. A dog and the ghost of Texas. They said the dog was dead. Then she heard him through the wall. The girl who listened and the town that finally did. Within 2 weeks, their story made national news. By the end of the month, they were on primetime. But Sophia had kept the attention at arm's length. She didn't want a spotlight. She wanted continuity, a way to turn pain into practice. And so she rebuilt. The barn was converted into housing for rescues. The west pasture was fenced off for play yards. Old stalls became quiet recovery rooms for traumatized animals. She even reopened the vet lab, just one table, one fridge, and a single surgical light that still flickered when it rained. It was enough, more than enough. Inside, Lily sat cross-legged on a beanbag in what used to be the feed room, now a story corner. On her lap was a spiral-bound journal, the cover hand-drawn with markers. Beside her, Rusty dozed in the sun. A group of school kids from the next town over sat in front of her wide-eyed. And then Lily said, pointing to the sketch of a hill, "He told me that even if you feel small, you can still carry something big. You just have to love it enough to not let go." A hand shot up. "Is that what Rusty did?" Lily nodded. "He carried Jonah's story. Until I was ready to hear it." The kids didn't laugh. They didn't roll their eyes. They listened, because something in her voice, calm, certain beyond her years, told them it was true. Sophia watched from the hallway, heart full. Rusty stirred in his sleep, groaned softly. He was older now. The limp in his back leg had never fully gone away. His eyesight had dulled in one eye. But every morning he was up before the sun, waiting for Lily at the front door, like clockwork. The bond between them had deepened in the months since. They didn't just walk together, they moved as if pulled by the same thread. Sometimes in the quiet hours, Sophia would find them out at the hill. Rusty lying in the grass, Lily tracing something in the dirt with a stick, letters, shaped sometimes just circles. She never interrupted. That space was sacred, and she had learned to honor it. The state of Texas had closed the file on Jonah's case. Eldridge Creel remained behind bars, awaiting trial for a crime that no longer needed evidence. It had testimony from beyond the grave. But Sophia didn't care about courtrooms. She cared about healing. One night, weeks after the sanctuary's opening, Sophia sat alone on the porch with a cup of tea. The stars were sharp above her, cold and brilliant. The wind carried the smell of hay and cedar. Lily opened the door quietly and sat beside her. "He came to me again," she said. Sophia looked over. Jonah. Lily nodded, but he didn't say anything this time. He just smiled. And Rusty licked his hand. Sophia said nothing. There were no words that could stretch far enough to explain what they had lived through. No phrasing that could untangle the threads of grief, violence, love, and salvation that had woven them into this new version of themselves. But Lily's presence was enough, and Rusty's breath behind them, slow and steady, was enough. Sometimes all you needed was enough. The next day, a woman arrived at the sanctuary with a trembling pit bull. Eyes wide, body scarred, a leash looped too tight around its neck. The woman cried as she handed the leash over. "I can't keep her," she said. "She's been through too much. I don't know how to help." Lily stepped forward without hesitation. She knelt in front of the dog, held out her hand, and whispered something that no one else heard. The dog licked her fingers, and then she sat down. The woman gasped. "How did you—" Lily smiled. "She's been waiting to be heard." Sophia stood in the doorway and closed her eyes. Yes, this was what the house was meant for now. A place where the broken could speak, where the small could be strong, where the stories people tried to bury would rise again, carried by children, by dogs, by love itself. That evening, another letter arrived. Handwritten. It read, "Dear Ms. Hart, I read your story while sitting in a hospital waiting room. I was there for reasons I'm not proud of. But when I read about Lily and Rusty, I started crying. Something in me cracked open. I don't know if I can explain it, but I want to try again, to live, to be kinder. Thank you for giving that to the world. P.S. I donated $500 in Jonah's name. I hope it helps save someone else." Sophia pressed the letter to her chest. Then she walked outside, found Lily and Rusty near the porch swing, and joined them. They didn't speak. They just sat, together, as the stars watched. And the hill beyond the pasture held its memories close, but not alone anymore. Now it had names. Now it had hope. And now it had a beginning. The living room looked nothing like it had months ago. Gone were the stained walls and the dust-choked curtains. The old floorboards had been scrubbed clean, and a woven rug now covered the spot where once there had been blood beneath the boards. The air smelled of lavender and wood polish, and late autumn light spilled in gently through the windows. But the soul of the room wasn't in the furniture. It was in the picture, mounted above the fireplace, where the painting of the lonely hill had once hung, crooked and secretive. Now hung a framed photograph. Lily and Rusty seated on the porch steps side by side, her arm around his neck, his eyes half closed, content. Behind them, the land stretched open, green, golden, forgiving. The frame was carved by hand. At the bottom, a small brass plate read, "For the ones who stayed, for the ones who heard." Sophia stood a few feet back from it now, alone in the quiet of late evening. The house was still the hum of sanctuary life, softened behind closed doors. The volunteers had gone home. The animals were sleeping. Lily had already been tucked into bed after another long day of reading stories to the new arrivals. Sophia sipped her tea, then set the mug down on the mantel. Her gaze stayed fixed on the photo. She could still remember the exact day it was taken, the light, the wind. The way Rusty had looked up at Lily, like he had finally arrived somewhere safe. A destination that had no fences, no pain, just belonging. Sophia stepped closer and gently straightened the frame. It had started to tilt again, leaning slightly to the left. She smiled faintly. "You always did come through that wall," she whispered. Then she turned to walk away. But before she could take a step, the air in the room shifted. No sudden gust, just a soft pressure like someone standing behind her. Just close enough to be felt, not seen. She stopped. The wind outside picked up, brushing gently against the house, and the frame moved. Not violently, just slightly. A gentle nudge enough to make it tilt again, exactly the way it had when she and Lily had first arrived at the farmhouse all those months ago. Sophia's breath caught. She stepped back toward the wall and gently lifted the picture. There was nothing behind it. No hole, no vent. The wall had been sealed and repainted. Perfect, whole. Still she leaned in, and in that moment so faint, it could have been imagination, she heard it. A soft bark, high-pitched, gentle, Rusty's bark, but not quite. Like an echo of a voice she never really knew, but always felt. She stepped back again, slowly returning the frame to its place, and let it hang tilted. Let it stay the way it had always been, as if something or someone was keeping watch from the other side. Later that night, Lily stirred in her sleep. Sophia, half asleep in the armchair beside her bed, looked up when she heard her daughter whisper. "He's gone now," Lily murmured. Sophia leaned forward. "Who, baby?" Lily didn't open her eyes. Her voice came from some place between dream and memory. "Jonah. He said thank you. He said the hill's not empty anymore." Sophia brushed Lily's hair from her forehead, and Rusty. Lily smiled, still dreaming. "He's right here." But part of him stayed with Jonah. The part that was waiting. Sophia didn't ask how she knew. She just kissed her daughter's forehead and held her hand until she fell back into full sleep. The wind whispered outside, weaving its way through the trees, like a lullaby only the past could hear. Weeks later, Sophia received a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a thin leather-bound notebook. The pages were blank, except one, the very first page. Written in careful, childlike script, "If someone's reading this, thank you. Tell her I'm not scared anymore. Tell Rusty he can rest. And tell the world we were here." Sophia closed the notebook with trembling hands. The world would know. The sanctuary continued to grow. More animals came. More children found healing in the quiet patience of those animals. Lily grew more confident. She began helping with training with rehabilitation. And sometimes when the sun was just right, she'd sit beneath the big oak tree near the hill and talk out loud, not to herself, but to the wind, to someone she insisted was always listening and always smiling. Rusty slowed down, as all dogs eventually do. He no longer chased the other pups, no longer climbed the porch steps 2 at a time, but he always rose when Lily entered a room. He always sat at the gate when a new arrival came, and he always stood beside Sophia when she stood in front of the fire. One evening, as winter approached, Sophia stood once again in the living room, staring up at the frame. The photo never faded, but the wall behind it. She could never look at it the same way again. Not because it was broken, but because it had been a door once, to something hidden, to something hurting, and now it was just a wall again. But maybe that was the miracle. Maybe healing meant letting the wall be a wall, even if part of you always waited for the bark behind it. Outside, the wind rose again. The frame tilted softly, and from deep within the quiet heart of the house, a sound whispered through the floorboards. Not a bark, not a creak, just breath, just memory, just love. Still here, still watching, and never ever forgotten.